The emergency department at Camp Pendleton Medical Center carried a constant rhythm. Machines hummed softly. Monitors blinked in quiet patterns of green and yellow light. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency between trauma bays while the distant echo of helicopter blades occasionally rolled across the base outside. It was controlled chaos, the kind that experienced medical staff understood instinctively. At the far end of the nurses' station stood Emma. She was new to the hospital, 6 weeks on the job. Her badge still looked too clean compared to the worn plastic of the veteran nurses beside her. Her blonde hair was tied back in a tight ponytail, a few loose strands escaping near her temple after a long shift. Her blue scrubs were slightly wrinkled, and her posture carried the quiet patience of someone used to observing before speaking. Most people barely noticed her. Dr. Caldwell noticed her just enough to remind her of her place. Observation before intervention, he had told her on her second day. It was the kind of advice senior doctors often gave rookie nurses, not cruel, just dismissive. To Caldwell, Emma was another inexperienced nurse fresh out of training. Someone who needed time before she could be trusted with real decisions. Emma never argued. She simply nodded and kept working. What Caldwell and the others didn't know was that Emma had learned that same lesson years earlier, not in classrooms, but in places where hesitation could mean someone died in the dust. But she never talked about that. She simply updated charts, monitored patients, and quietly noticed things others overlooked. That afternoon felt ordinary. A patient with heat exhaustion in Bay 2, a minor training injury from the base obstacle course. A mother with a child suffering from dehydration. Nothing unusual. Then the ER doors burst open. The sound slammed through the hallway like an explosion. Two paramedics rushed inside, pushing a stretcher at full speed. The wheels rattled against the tile floor as the medics steered the bed toward Trauma Bay 3. On the stretcher lay a young girl. She looked about 18. Her red dress was wrinkled and slightly torn at the sleeve, wildly out of place inside a military hospital. Her face was pale, her head rolled weakly with the movements of the stretcher. Female, 18, sudden collapse, one paramedic shouted while running beside the bed. No visible trauma, heart rhythm unstable. Doctors and nurses instantly surrounded the stretcher. Oxygen, Caldwell ordered. Monitor her vitals. Yet and Roman 4 line ready. The team moved quickly. But they all stopped at the same moment. Because something else had entered the trauma bay with them. A massive black military K9. The dog's claws scraped against the floor as it charged beside the stretcher, muscles tight beneath its sleek coat. Its eyes never left the unconscious girl. One of the nurses whispered under her breath. "That's General Carter's daughter." The words spread through the room like a spark across dry grass. General Robert Carter was one of the highest-ranking Marine officers on the West Coast. Everyone on base knew the name, which meant every person in the room suddenly understood the pressure they were under. The stretcher rolled into Trauma Bay 3, the moment a nurse reached toward the patient's arm to insert in Roman 4 line. The dog exploded into motion. In a blur of black muscle and speed, the K9 leapt onto the stretcher. Its front paws slammed down across the girl's chest as it planted itself directly over her body. A thunderous bark filled the room. The sound echoed off the walls like a gunshot. The nurses jumped backward. "Get that dog off her," Caldwell shouted. 2 security officers rushed forward. The dog spun instantly. Its teeth snapped inches from one officer's arm. The officer jerked back in shock. Nobody moved closer. The K9 stood rigid over the girl, barking furiously at anyone who approached. It wasn't random aggression. It was deliberate. Controlled. Protective. The heart monitor beside the bed began to beep faster. Then slower. The numbers dropped. "Her pulse is crashing," a nurse said nervously. But no one could reach her. "Sedate the dog," someone suggested. The idea hung in the air for a moment. Then another nurse shook her head. "If it collapses onto her chest, it could crush her airway." The dog barked again. Louder this time. The room was frozen. Doctors? Nurses? Security officers? All blocked by a single animal standing guard over an unconscious patient. Emma watched from near the doorway. Her eyes weren't on the girl. They were on the dog. She noticed something the others didn't. The K9 wasn't attacking randomly. It wasn't panicking. It was guarding. Its stance was precise. Front paws forward. Weight balanced. Head moving only when someone approached. A posture Emma had seen before. Years ago. Under very different skies. For a brief moment, an old memory flickered through her mind. That? Gunfire. A wounded Marine bleeding into sand while a military dog stood over him, refusing to let anyone close. A mass stepped forward. Don't, Caldwell said sharply. Nurse, stay back. But she kept walking. Slowly. Carefully. The K9's head snapped toward her instantly. Its body tensed. Everyone expected the dog to lunge. A mass stopped 2 feet from the stretcher. She crouched slightly so her eyes met the dog's. For several seconds, neither moved. The dog's chest rose and fell in steady breaths. A mass studied the animal carefully. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm. Quiet. But firm. 4 words. Guardian protocol. Stand down. The effect was immediate. The barking stopped. The massive dog stepped backward off the stretcher. Then it sat down beside the bed. Perfectly still. The entire trauma bay went silent. The only sound left was the steady beeping of the heart monitor. For several seconds, nobody spoke. A Marine medic standing near the doorway stared at Emma in disbelief. He leaned toward another Marine and whispered, "That command?" His voice trailed off. They stopped using that after Afghanistan. Every pair of eyes in the room slowly turned toward Emma. Doctor, Caldwell stared at her. For the first time since she started working there. He looked unsure. Nurse, he said slowly. Where did you learn that command? Emma didn't answer. She simply pulled on a pair of gloves, picked up the Roman 4 needle, and stepped toward the patient. Because the girl's heart monitor had just started dropping again, and someone needed to act. The silence inside Trauma Bay 3 lasted only a moment. Then the room snapped back into motion. Whoa, doctor, Caldwell barked. The spell that had frozen the staff broke instantly. Nurses rushed forward with equipment. A respiratory technician fitted an oxygen mask over the unconscious girl's face while another nurse prepared medication trays. Emma slid the Roman 4 needle into the patient's arm with steady precision. Her hands didn't tremble. They never did. Line secure, she said quietly. A nurse connected the tubing while Caldwell leaned over the patient, examining her pupils under the harsh white trauma lights. Vitals, he demanded. Heart rate irregular, 110 and dropping, a technician answered from the monitor. The green line across the screen flickered in jagged rhythms. The K9 sat beside the stretcher, silent now. But it watched everything. Its eyes moved slowly from one doctor to another as if evaluating each person in the room. Emma noticed. She also noticed something else. The dog's breathing was controlled, focused, or not relieved. Which meant whatever it had been guarding against earlier, it still believed the threat was present. Blood pressure falling, another nurse reported. Caldwell frowned. There's no trauma, no bleeding, no obvious cause. The red dress had already been cut open with trauma shears. Beneath it, the patient's skin showed no wounds, no bruising, nothing that explained why her heart rhythm looked like it was collapsing. One of the Marine medics stepped closer. Sir, he said quietly. That's General Carter's daughter. I'm aware, Caldwell replied sharply. Everyone was aware. And that knowledge hovered over the room like pressure in the air before a storm. Treating a critical patient was stressful under any circumstances. Treating the daughter of a 4-star Marine general meant every decision would be scrutinized later. The heart monitor beeped again. Doctor, the technician said. She's crashing. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Prepare cardiac support, he said. Emma leaned closer to the patient. Her eyes moved carefully across the girl's face. Something about the symptoms felt wrong. The numbers on the monitor suggested cardiac failure. But the patient's body told a different story. Her breathing wasn't shallow enough. Her skin wasn't cold the way true cardiac collapse usually appeared. Emma studied the girl's jaw. A faint twitch moved along the muscle near her cheek. Almost invisible. Most people in the room missed it. But Emma had seen that twitch before. Years earlier, on a dusty road in Helmand province. Her gaze shifted slowly toward the canine. The dog's head had tilted slightly. Its nose pointed toward the Roman forestand. Not barking. Just staring. Emma followed its gaze. The clear plastic bag of saline hung above the patient, dripping slowly into the Roman foreline. Everything looked normal. But the dog hadn't moved its eyes from it. Behind her, Caldwell spoke again. Run a toxicology panel. A nurse hurried toward the lab station. Full cardiac workup, Caldwell added. The Marine medic near the doorway stepped closer to Emma. Ma'am, he said quietly. That command you used earlier. Emma kept her attention on the patient's pulse. Afghanistan, she replied. The Marine blinked. You were deployed. Emma didn't answer. Instead, she leaned closer to the patient again. The girl's eyelids fluttered. A weak breath escaped beneath the oxygen mask. Emily, Emma said softly. Can you hear me? The girl's eyes opened slightly. They struggled to focus. Then they drifted toward the large black dog beside the stretcher. Titan, she whispered faintly. The canine's ears lifted instantly. Its tail tapped the floor once. Good boy, Emma said quietly. Emily's breathing trembled. Dad told Titan, never leave me, she murmured. He is doing a good job, Emma replied. The girl's eyes moved slowly across the room. Then she whispered something else. Something so soft Emma almost missed it. Something smelled strange. Emily's eyes closed again. Her body went limp. The heart monitor shrieked. Her pulse dropped sharply. She's losing rhythm, a nurse shouted. Emma straightened slowly. Something smelled strange. Her mind moved quickly through the symptoms. The muscle twitching. The unstable heartbeat. The sudden collapse without trauma. Her eyes moved again to the Roman 4 bag. The dog was still staring at it. Titan suddenly stood. A sharp bark echoed through the trauma bay. Everyone turned toward the animal again. The dog stepped closer to the Roman 4 stand. Another bark. Louder this time. Emma's eyes widened slightly. Stop the Roman 4, she said sharply. The room froze. Caldwell turned toward her. What? Stop it now, Emma repeated. The nurse beside the Roman 4 stand hesitated. Caldwell stared at Emma in disbelief. Nurse, you better explain. The dog barked again. Admiral. It took another step toward the Roman 4 bag. Emma pointed directly at the tubing. Plembet. Something in her voice cut through the hesitation. The nurse reached up and shut the line. The drip stopped instantly. Caldwell stepped forward. Nurse, he said slowly. You're interrupting treatment on a critical patient. Emma leaned closer to Emily's arm. A faint redness had begun spreading along the skin near the Roman 4 site. Far too quickly for normal irritation. The muscle twitching in Emily's fingers returned. But now Emma could see the pattern clearly. It wasn't random. It was neurological. Her voice remained calm. This isn't cardiac failure. Caldwell frowned. We already considered that possibility. Emma shook her head slightly. No, she said quietly. This is exposure. The word landed heavily. The Marine medic near the door stiffened immediately. Exposure to what? Caldwell asked. Emma didn't answer immediately. She gently lifted Emily's wrist, examining the skin carefully under the light. The redness was spreading faster now. Behind her, Titan let out a low growl. Not aggressive. Warning. Emma looked at Caldwell. Possibly chemical exposure, she said. The room went completely silent. Someone whispered from behind the monitors. Chemical? Caldwell stared at her. You're suggesting a toxin? Emma nodded slightly. Possibly nerve agent contamination. A nurse inhaled sharply. Another stepped back instinctively. The ER suddenly felt smaller. The air heavier. Caldwell crossed his arms slowly. That's a serious claim. I know. What evidence do you have? Emma gestured toward the dog. Ask him. Several heads turned toward Titan. The K9 had moved directly beside the Roman 4 stand. Its nose hovered inches from the plastic bag. It barked once more, then looked directly at Emma, like it expected her to understand. And she did. The dog wasn't blocking us earlier, Emma said quietly. He was blocking contact. Caldwell's expression shifted. You think the contamination was on her? Or on something touching her? Emma carefully lifted the Roman 4 bag from the stand without reconnecting the line. Under the bright trauma lights, the fluid looked completely normal. Clear. Colorless. But appearances meant nothing. Emma had seen nerve agents diluted so heavily they looked exactly like water. Until they started shutting down a human nervous system. Her mind flickered briefly to an old memory. A battlefield medic tent. A soldier convulsing on a stretcher. A military dog barking at a medical supply pack no one else suspected. Emma pushed the memory away. She looked back at Caldwell. We need decontamination protocol. A nurse stared at her. Here in the ER? Yes. Caldwell rubbed his jaw slowly. You're asking me to initiate chemical containment based on a dog and a guess. Emma met his eyes. It's not a guess. What makes you so sure? For the first time since the patient arrived, Emma hesitated. Then she said quietly, I treated the same agent in Afghanistan. The Marine medic straightened instantly. You were deployed. Emma didn't answer. But the room had already changed. Because suddenly, the rookie nurse didn't look like a rookie anymore. For several seconds, no one in Trauma Bay 3 moved. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The heart monitor pulsed its uneven rhythm. Titan stood beside the Roman 4 stand, staring at the bag as if it were an enemy he could smell but not see. Doctor, Caldwell studied Emma carefully. Moments earlier she had been, in his mind, a quiet rookie nurse barely 6 weeks into civilian hospital work. Now she stood in front of him calmly suggesting a chemical exposure incident inside a military hospital. The accusation was enormous. If she was wrong, they would waste critical minutes during a cardiac emergency. If she was right, the entire emergency department might already be contaminated. Caldwell exhaled slowly. What agent? He asked. Emma glanced down at Emily's trembling fingers. Hard to say without labs, she replied, but the neurological twitching, unstable rhythm, rapid onset. She paused briefly. It resembles diluted nerve agent exposure. One of the nurses whispered under her breath. On a Marine base? The idea felt impossible. Yet Titan barked again. Short, cow. The dog's nose pressed closer to the Roman 4 bag. Caldwell looked at the animal. Then back at Emma. You've seen this before? Ness? Where? Emma didn't answer the question directly. Helmand Province, she said quietly. That name carried weight. Several Marines in the room exchanged glances. Helmand had been one of the most dangerous regions during the Afghan conflict. Not a place where ordinary nurses gained experience. Caldwell finally turned to the staff. Begin decontamination protocol. The room exploded into motion. Nurses rushed to sealed cabinets and pulled out emergency protective gear. A technician hurried to disable the ventilation unit above the trauma bay. Plastic containment barriers were rolled into position around the patient's bed. Another nurse carefully removed the Roman 4 bag from the stand and sealed it inside a biohazard container. Titan stepped back slightly, watching every movement. Emily's breathing became more uneven. Her fingers twitched again. The heart monitor dipped. Doctor, the technician said urgently. She's losing rhythm again. Caldwell looked toward Emma. If this is nerve agent exposure, what's the treatment? Emma had already moved to the medication tray. Her hands worked quickly but calmly as she prepared a syringe. Antidote protocol, she said. Caldwell noticed something that made him pause. You already drew it? Emma glanced up briefly. I recognized the symptoms. The doctor studied her face for a moment. Then he stepped aside. Do it. Emma leaned toward the Roman 4 port and slowly injected the medication. The room became silent again. Everyone watched the monitor. For several long seconds, nothing changed. The green mine continued its unstable rhythm. A nurse shifted nervously beside the equipment cart. What a... The sentence never finished. Because the tremor in Emily's fingers began to slow. The twitching in her jaw stopped. The monitor beeped again. This time the rhythm steadied. The numbers on the screen climbed slowly back toward normal. A long breath escaped from the respiratory technician. She's stabilizing. Caldwell stared at the monitor. Well, he muttered quietly. I'll be damned. Titan's ears lifted. The tension in the room shifted instantly. The canine walked calmly across the floor and sat down beside him as leg. The movement didn't go unnoticed. One of the Marines near the doorway stared openly now. You said Afghanistan, he said slowly. What unit were you with? Emma didn't respond. She simply checked Emily's pulse again. The heartbeat felt stronger beneath her fingers. Outside the building, a distant sound began to grow louder. At first it was faint, then unmistakable. Helicopter rotors. The thunder of blades echoed across the base. Several people in the room looked toward the ceiling. Caldwell nodded once. That'll be him. The Marine medic straightened immediately. General Carter. The helicopter noise grew louder as the aircraft descended toward the hospital landing pad. Inside the trauma bay, Emily stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open. She took a slow breath beneath the oxygen mask. Her eyes drifted across the room, then focused weakly on the large black dog beside the bed. Titan. The canine stood instantly. Its tail tapped the floor once. I'm here, Emma said gently. Emily's gaze shifted again. Then she whispered a single word. That. The helicopter outside settled onto the landing pad with a thunderous roar. Inside the ER hallway, military police were already moving. Boots echoed against the tile floor. Radio chatter crackled through the air. A tall figure stepped through the emergency entrance moments later. General Robert Carter walked with controlled urgency. His marine dress uniform moved slightly in the wind, still clinging to his jacket from the helicopter landing. Two officers tried briefing him as they walked beside him, but the general barely slowed his stride. Where is she? He asked once. A nurse pointed down the hallway. Trauma Bay 3, sir. Carter moved immediately. The hallway parted around him as staff stepped aside. Inside the trauma bay, Titan's ears lifted again. The dog recognized the approaching footsteps before anyone else heard them. The doors opened. General Carter stepped inside. For a moment, the powerful Marine officer who commanded thousands of soldiers looked like something else entirely. A father. His eyes found the red dress on the hospital stretcher instantly. Emily looked toward him weakly. That? The general crossed the room in seconds. I'm here, he said softly. He took her hand carefully. Titan shifted slightly, allowing him space beside the bed. The heart monitor beeped steadily above them. Carter studied the screen briefly. The numbers looked stable. Relief flickered across his face. Then he looked toward Dr. Caldwell. What happened? Caldwell cleared his throat. Your daughter experienced chemical exposure earlier today. Carter's expression hardened. Chemical? The situation escalated quickly, Caldwell continued. But one of our nurses recognized the symptoms. He gestured toward Emma. Carter's eyes shifted to her. For a moment he said nothing. He simply studied her carefully. Emma stood quietly beside the bed. Blue scrubs. Hospital badge. Calm posture. She didn't look like someone who had just taken command of a critical emergency. She looked like exactly what her badge said. Staff nurse. Ruby. 6 weeks into her job. Carter glanced toward Titan. The dog was watching him now. Not the room. Not the doctors. And the dog? Carter asked. Caldwell answered carefully. Titan refused to let anyone treat the patient when she arrived. He blocked access completely. What changed? Caldwell gestured again toward Emma. She gave him a command. Carter raised an eyebrow. What command? Emma met his gaze. Guardian protocol, she said. The general's expression shifted immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. That phrase belonged to a very specific military training program. One that hadn't been used in years. Carter studied her again. Where did you hear that code, nurse? Emma answered the same way she had earlier. Huh? Sambal. I served as a combat medic in Afghanistan, sir. The room went silent again. Titan stood up. The large canine walked slowly across the floor. Past the doctors. Past the Marines. Past everyone. He stopped beside Emma. Then sat down next to her. His tail tapped the tile floor softly. General Carter watched the dog for a moment. Then looked back at Emma. He remembers you, Carter said quietly. Emma gave a small nod. Dogs like him don't forget the war. For a few moments after the general's arrival, the trauma bay settled into a fragile calm. Emily's breathing had stabilized beneath the oxygen mask. The green line on the heart monitor moved in steady, reassuring waves. The frantic tension that had filled the room earlier had softened into careful observation. Titan remained beside Emma. The large canine sat calmly, his posture relaxed but attentive, dark eyes quietly watching everything. General Carter rested a hand on his daughter's arm. You're safe now, he said gently. Emily managed a faint smile beneath the mask. Titan didn't leave. He wouldn't, Carter replied. The bond between the girl and the dog was obvious. Titan had been trained for combat patrols overseas, but for Emily he had become something more: guardian, companion, silent protector. Across the room, Dr. Caldwell cleared his throat. General, we're still determining the source of the contamination. Carter nodded once. What do we know? Caldwell gestured toward the sealed biohazard container that held the Roman 4 bag. We suspect a toxin may have been introduced through medical equipment or contact exposure. We've isolated the suspected source and initiated decontamination procedures. And my daughter? Carter asked. Stable for now, Caldwell said, thanks to the antidote administered earlier. The general's eyes moved toward Emma again. She stood quietly beside the medical cart, documenting notes on a tablet. No pride. No attention-seeking. Just routine work. Carter watched her for a moment longer before turning back toward his daughter. Outside the trauma bay, however, the calm was already disappearing. Boots echoed down the hallway. 2 men in dark suits entered the emergency department accompanied by military police. They weren't hospital staff. Their presence carried the unmistakable weight of federal authority. The Marines near the entrance immediately stepped aside. One of the men spoke briefly into a radio. Chemical response team arriving in 2 minutes. The word spread through the hallway instantly. Inside Trauma Bay 3, Caldwell noticed the movement outside. Looks like the investigation begins now, he muttered. Moments later, the Trauma Bay doors opened again. The 2 federal agents stepped inside. One flashed a badge. Defense Criminal Investigative Service. The other scanned the room quickly. We understand a possible chemical exposure occurred here. Caldwell nodded. That's correct. Who identified the contamination? Caldwell hesitated. Then gestured toward Emma. You did. Every eye in the room shifted again. The agents looked at Emma carefully. You recognized a nerve agent? Yes, she replied calmly. Based on what training? Emma paused briefly. Previous field experience. The agent narrowed his eyes slightly. What kind of field experience? Before she could answer, Caldwell spoke. She served as a combat medic during the Afghanistan conflict. The agent nodded slowly. That information clearly changed his assessment. Understood. The second agent turned toward the sealed container holding the Roman 4 bag. Has anyone touched this since it was removed? No, Caldwell said. It was sealed immediately. That? Outside the trauma bay, a team wearing protective gear arrived with specialized equipment. Portable scanners. Containment kits. The investigation was escalating quickly. Meanwhile, hospital administration had finally arrived. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Raymond Mercer entered the ER with an expression that showed both authority and irritation. Mercer had been attending a conference across base when the incident began. Now he walked into the chaos with visible frustration. What exactly is happening here? He demanded. Caldwell gestured toward the investigation team. Possible chemical contamination. Mercer's eyes moved immediately to the agents, then to the containment equipment, then finally to Emma. And who authorized this disruption of my emergency department? Caldwell spoke carefully. She identified the toxin. Mercer's expression darkened. A nurse made that call? Emma remained silent. Caldwell nodded. Yes. Mercer crossed his arms. That is a serious procedural violation. General Carter slowly turned toward the administrator. She saved my daughter's life, he said. Mercer stiffened slightly under the weight of the general's gaze. General, with respect, initiating chemical containment without confirmation can shut down an entire hospital wing. And if she had been wrong? Emma finally spoke. But she wasn't. Mercer looked directly at her now. You are a civilian nurse 6 weeks into employment here. Yes, sir. And you took control of a critical emergency response based on your personal judgment? Emma didn't raise her voice. The patient's symptoms matched nerve agent exposure. And you interrupted medical protocol to act on that assumption. Yes? Mercer shook his head. This hospital operates under strict chain of command procedures. Caldwell looked uncomfortable now. But Mercer continued. You may have acted with good intentions, Nurse Emma, but protocol exists for a reason. General Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. You're disciplining a person who saved my daughter. Mercer spoke carefully. I'm ensuring proper procedure is followed. One of the federal investigators stepped closer to the sealed container. Gentlemen, he said, we may want to wait for lab confirmation before assigning blame. Mercer ignored the comment. He looked back at Emma. Until the investigation concludes, you are removed from patient care. The words hung in the room like a slap. Several nurses exchanged stunned looks. Even Caldwell seemed surprised. Doctor, he started. Mercer raised a hand. That's final. Emma didn't argue. She simply removed her gloves and placed them in the disposal bin. Then she stepped away from the patient bed. Titan stood up immediately. The dog followed her across the room. Mercer noticed. Get that animal back to its handler, he snapped. Titan didn't move. The canine sat down beside Emma again, like he had chosen his position. General Carter watched the scene carefully. Then he turned to the federal agent. How long until we know what was in that Roman 4 bag? Preliminary analysis within the hour, the agent said. Carter nodded once. Then we wait. Emma quietly walked toward the nurse's station. The hallway felt strangely silent now. Some of the staff watched her pass with expressions of confusion. Others with quiet respect. Inside Trauma Bay 3, Mercer continued speaking with the investigators. But Titan suddenly stood again. The dog turned his head toward the biohazard container. Then toward the hallway. Then back to the container. He barked once. Go. Warning. The federal agent frowned. That dog reacting to something? Emma stopped walking. She slowly turned back toward the room. Her eyes moved to Titan. Then to the sealed container. Then to the investigators. Her voice was calm. You might want to test that bag quickly. The agent looked at her. Why? Emma met his eyes. Because if I'm right. She glanced at the container again. That toxin wasn't meant for Emily. The entire room went silent again. Because suddenly, this didn't look like an accident anymore. The room held its breath after Emma spoke. Even the quiet hum of the overhead lights seemed louder in the silence that followed. The sealed biohazard container sat on the metal counter beneath the trauma lights. Inside it, the Roman 4 bag looked completely harmless, clear fluid, transparent plastic, a simple hospital label. Yet every person in the room now stared at it as if it were a loaded weapon. The federal investigator crouched beside the container. You're suggesting the toxin was intentional, he said. Emma didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved to Titan. The canine had returned to his alert stance, ears forward, body tense, nose aimed directly at the sealed bag. He hasn't stopped watching it, she said quietly. That dog is trained to detect chemical agents. The investigator nodded slowly. He turned toward his partner. Failed test. The second agent opened a black equipment case and removed a compact detection scanner. The device emitted a faint electronic hum as it powered on. Doctor, Mercer folded his arms impatiently. This is getting out of hand, the hospital administrator muttered. We've already shut down half the emergency department based on speculation. General Carter didn't respond. His attention remained fixed on the test. The agent carefully opened the outer containment bag just enough to slide the scanner probe inside. The machine chirped softly. Everyone leaned closer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the scanner gave a sharp warning tone. The display screen flashed red. The investigator's expression hardened. Well, he said quietly. She was right. A heavy silence fell over the trauma bay. The agent stood and looked toward General Carter. Trace levels of a diluted nerve agent. Mercer's face went pale. Caldwell rubbed his forehead slowly. So the contamination was real, he said. Yes, the investigator replied. And the patient would likely have died within minutes without treatment. Every person in the room understood what that meant. Emma had not only recognized the agent, she had identified it fast enough to stop it. The investigator turned toward her. You said you've treated this before. Emma gave a small nod. Enough field. The man studied her carefully. What unit were you attached to? Emma hesitated. Then simply replied. Medical support. The answer was technically correct, but it revealed almost nothing. Meanwhile, Titan suddenly stood again. The canine moved toward the container and barked once more. Then he turned his head toward the doorway. The investigator noticed. What's he doing? Emma watched the dog carefully. He's still tracking something. The agent frowned. From the bag? Possibly. The agent looked toward the hallway. If the toxin came from that Roman 4 bag. He stopped speaking. The implication was obvious. Someone had put it there. Mercer spoke quickly. That's impossible. Our medical supplies are tightly controlled. The investigator looked at him calmly. Doctor, someone just tried to kill the daughter of a Marine general inside your hospital. Mercer fell silent. Outside the trauma bay, more military personnel had arrived. The hallway filled with quiet radio chatter and the controlled movement of security teams. The situation had escalated far beyond a medical emergency. Now it was a criminal investigation. Inside the room, Carter looked at him again. You recognized a nerve agent from a few symptoms, he said. Yes, sir. You trusted a dog's behavior when trained doctors hesitated. Yes. And you administered treatment before waiting for lab confirmation. Yes. Carter nodded slowly. That decision saved my daughter's life. Emma said nothing. Across the room, Mercer shifted uncomfortably. Well, the administrator said stiffly, that doesn't change the fact that hospital protocol was violated. Several people turned toward him. Even the investigators looked surprised by the comment. Mercer continued defensively. A civilian nurse initiating chemical containment without authorization could have caused widespread panic. Carter looked at him coldly. She prevented a death. Mercer cleared his throat. That remains to be fully reviewed. Before anyone could respond, one of the federal agents spoke into his radio. Command, we have confirmation of nerve agent contamination inside the medical supply line. A pause followed. Then the radio crackled. Understood. Secure the facility. The investigator looked back at the room. Until we determine how that toxin entered the Roman 4 system, this hospital is now part of an active federal investigation. Mercer's expression tightened. You're locking down my hospital? Yes. The agent gestured toward the sealed container. And the person who identified the toxin will need to provide a full statement. He looked toward Emma. Immediately, Mercer stepped forward. She has already been removed from duty pending administrative review. The investigator raised an eyebrow. Removed from duty? Yes, Mercer said firmly. Her actions violated protocol. The agent stared at him for a moment. Then he turned to Carter. General, are you comfortable with that decision? Carter's eyes moved slowly toward the administrator. For a moment, the room felt very small. My daughter is alive, Carter said quietly. Because of her. Mercer didn't respond. Titan suddenly stood and walked across the room again. The large canine stopped beside Emma. He sat beside her like a silent soldier awaiting orders. The investigator watched the dog. That animal clearly trusts her. Carter nodded. That dog served 2 combat tours. He looked toward Emma again. They don't hand out that kind of loyalty easily. The federal agent studied her with new curiosity. You said you served as a medic. Yes. What unit? Emma hesitated again. Before she could answer, another voice spoke from the hallway. Actually. Everyone turned. A Marine officer had just entered the trauma bay. His uniform carried the insignia of a senior operations commander. He looked directly at Emma. I believe I know exactly what unit she served with. The room grew quiet again. The officer stepped closer. His eyes carried the recognition of someone seeing an old memory return. He looked at Carter. Sir, with permission. Carter nodded. The officer turned toward the investigators. You're looking at someone who wasn't just a combat medic. He gestured toward Emma. She was attached to one of the most classified medical response teams deployed during the Afghan conflict. Mercer frowned. What team? The Marine officer answered calmly. The Tier 1 Battlefield Trauma Unit. Several people in the room blinked. Even Caldwell looked stunned. Those teams had been legendary among military medics. Rapid response surgical teams operating in active combat zones. The officer continued. Per unit treated soldiers in places where evacuation helicopters couldn't reach. He looked directly at Mercer. The survival rates from those missions became part of military medical training worldwide. The administrator stared at Emma. You never mentioned that. Emma simply replied. No one asked. Titan's tail tapped softly against the floor. The canine leaned slightly against her leg. The investigator nodded slowly. Well, he said. That certainly explains how a rookie nurse recognized a nerve agent faster than anyone else in this building. Across the room, Mercer said nothing. Because suddenly, the quiet nurse he had just suspended didn't look inexperienced at all. She looked like someone who had been saving lives in places far more dangerous than a hospital. And the entire room was beginning to realize it. The room remained silent after the Marine officer finished speaking. The words hung in the air like a truth no one in the hospital had expected to hear. Tier 1 Battlefield Trauma Unit. Among military medical teams, that phrase carried enormous weight. Those units were deployed only in the most dangerous situations, when helicopters couldn't land, when evacuation routes were cut off, when soldiers would die unless someone could operate in the middle of a battlefield. And the quiet nurse standing beside the medical cart had been part of one. Dr. Caldwell slowly leaned back against the counter. For the first time since he had met her, he realized something uncomfortable. He had spent 6 weeks teaching Emma how to behave in an emergency room. Meanwhile, she had spent years keeping soldiers alive in active war zones. Across the room, Dr. Mercer's confidence had faded completely. The administrator stared at him as if he were seeing her for the first time. You were assigned to that unit? Mercer asked. Emma nodded once. Yes, sir. Mercer shook his head slightly. And you chose to become a civilian nurse afterward? Yes. Why? Emma's answer was simple. People still need help. No dramatic explanation. No story about the war. Just the quiet truth. Meanwhile, the federal investigators had shifted their attention back to the toxin container. One of the agents spoke into his radio again. Lab confirmation needed immediately. The response crackled back through the speaker. Preliminary results already processing. The investigator glanced at Carter. If the nerve agent came through the Roman force supply line, someone inside the hospital could have introduced it. The implication settled heavily across the room. This wasn't just a medical incident. It was attempted murder, possibly even an act of sabotage. Outside the trauma bay, security teams had begun searching supply rooms and reviewing surveillance footage. Boots echoed down the hallway as Marines moved quickly through the building. Inside the room, Titan remained beside Emma. The K9 leaned slightly against her leg. He had chosen his position. General Carter noticed. Titan rarely does that, he said quietly. Emma rested a hand briefly on the dog's head. He remembers the training, she replied. Carter studied the dog thoughtfully. Those commands haven't been used in years. Dogs remember longer than people, Emma said. Across the room, Caldwell finally spoke. Nurse. Emma looked toward him. The doctor seemed slightly uncomfortable. I owe you an apology. Emma tilted her head slightly. For what? For assuming you were inexperienced. Emma smiled faintly. You were wrong. Caldwell blinked. What do you mean? This is my first civilian hospital. The doctor couldn't help but laugh quietly. Fair point. Before anyone else could speak, the federal investigator's radio crackled again. Agent Keller. Nas. Lab results confirmed. The agent straightened. What do we have? Diluted VX compound. The words dropped like a stone into still water. VX was one of the most dangerous nerve agents ever developed. Even small doses could kill within minutes. The agent looked around the room. That wasn't an accident. Mercer swallowed hard. How could something like that get into our hospital supplies? The investigator answered bluntly. Someone put it there. Outside the trauma bay, a Marine officer hurried into the hallway carrying a tablet. Sir, he said, addressing the investigators. We've located the source. Everyone turned. The officer tapped the tablet screen. Surveillance footage appeared. The video showed a hospital supply corridor earlier that afternoon. A civilian contractor stood beside a cart of medical equipment. He appeared to be checking inventory. Then he reached into a bag and briefly handled one of the Roman 4 kits before placing it back. The officer froze the image. That contractor doesn't work for the hospital, he said. Fake credentials. The investigators exchanged looks. Where is he now? Left the building about 30 minutes before the incident. The agent nodded grimly. Then we have our suspect. General Carter's voice remained calm but cold. Find him. Outside the hospital, military police vehicles were already leaving the base. The investigation had moved beyond the ER. Inside the trauma bay, Emily shifted slightly in the bed. Her eyes opened again. The antidote had done its job. She whispered. Carter stepped closer immediately. I'm here. Emily's gaze moved across the room. It settled on Emma. You helped me, she said softly. Emma stepped closer. You help yourself, she replied gently. Titan walked to the side of the bed. Emily reached down weakly and rested a hand against the dog's head. He didn't let anyone touch me, she murmured. Emma nodded. He knew something was wrong. Emily looked back at her. Thank you. Emma simply nodded. Across the room, Dr. Mercer stood very quietly. The earlier arrogance had completely disappeared. The administrator finally spoke. Nurse Emma. She looked toward him. Mercer cleared his throat. It appears your actions were justified. Emma didn't respond. Mercer shifted awkwardly. Your suspension will be lifted immediately. Caldwell muttered quietly under his breath. How generous. Mercer ignored the comment. But the room had already changed. The authority he had tried to assert earlier no longer carried the same weight. Because everyone now knew who had actually taken control when it mattered. Later that evening, the emergency department slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Patients arrived. Monitors beeped. Nurses moved through the hallways again. The investigation continued in other parts of the base. But inside the ER, things felt strangely ordinary. Emma sat at the nurse's station finishing her report. Her typing was calm and methodical. Just another chart. Just another shift. Across the hallway, Emily rested in a recovery room. Titan slept curled beside the bed. General Carter stepped out of the room and walked slowly down the hall. He stopped beside the nurse's station. Emma looked up. The general removed his cap. Marine, he said simply. Emma stood automatically. Carter extended his hand. Thank you for bringing my daughter back. Emma shook his hand once. The gesture was brief. Respectful. Nothing more. After a moment, Carter nodded and walked away down the hallway. A few minutes later, Titan appeared beside the nurse's station. The big dog walked directly to Emma and sat beside her chair. His tail thumped softly against the floor. One of the other nurses smiled. Well, she said, looks like you have a partner now. Emma reached down and scratched the dog behind the ear. He just remembers the war, she said quietly. Outside the hospital, news reporters were still discussing the mysterious incident at Camp Pendleton. Inside the ER, however, the moment had already passed. The lights dimmed slightly as night shift began. A calm nurse updated patient charts. A loyal dog rested beside her chair. And most people in the hospital would never fully understand how close that day had come to ending very differently. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has already faced the hardest battles. The one who doesn't need recognition. The one who simply does the job when it matters most. And when the moment passes, they return to work as if nothing extraordinary happened. If this story reminded you that the heroes around us are often the ones nobody notices at first, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what you would have done. If this story reminded you that real heroes are often the ones nobody notices, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what you would have done.